Kia ora, morena, everyone. Tēnā koutou katoa, now mai haere mai. Good morning and welcome, whānau and special friends who have tuned in to this fantastic lecture series of Thinkers and Doers. I'm Brennan Baxley, Chair of the Wellington Branch, New Zealand Institute of Landscape Architects. This online webinar has been supported by the New Zealand Institute of Landscape Architects Wellington Branch and the Landscape Architecture Program at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. The Thinkers and Doers, as a reminder, aims at bringing together national and international practitioners, scholars, students, and wider community of landscape architecture and affiliated built environment disciplines to share their ideas and hear the latest innovations in the field. Today, we are quite excitingly joined by an ingenious and clever designer, Roberto Rivera in Miami, Florida. I have been fortunate enough to not only be educated by Roberto in my formal years, but work in his practice for a few years. His interests, pedagogy, and sharp eye for pop, place, and pragmatism still remain rooted in my core values as a landscape architect today in New Zealand. Roberto is a registered landscape architect, the principal of Studio Roberto Rovira, an associate professor and the chair of the Landscape Architecture, Environmental, and Urban Design at Florida International University in Miami. As a highly recognized educator and professional by prominent organizations such as the Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture, American Society of Landscape Architects, the Architecture League, and many others, Roberto has worked and designed internationally and across different media and scope, including environmental installations, competitions, arts, and art commissions. His lecture today will cover design and research projects whose approach tries to connect cultural and natural factors in their built and conceptual form. Without losing the speaker at this point, I will now pass the presentation to Roberto for a 25-minute lecture, followed by a 5 to 10-minute question and answer. And just a couple of house rules that Roberto will be sharing his screen. If you could please put your microphone on mute and hold the questions till the end. So thank you, Roberto, for joining us today.
Thank you, Brennan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to be here, and I'm really honored. And I want to thank the Victoria University of Wellington and the New Zealand Institute of Landscape Architects for having me across several time zones, and also for some of the friends I see on the screen. Thank you for joining, and some new friends, hopefully. I'm honored by the invitation, and I titled the talk, People, Place, and Ecologically Informed Design. I think that these ideas and hopefully the projects and the different investigations that I have prepared will kind of show the way of thinking that drives everything that we do. We have a small practice in Miami, some very capable, outstanding folks among the alumni, Brennan, as he mentioned. So without further ado, let me get rolling here. And I think that probably one of the things that informs my design is really the place where I live, the places that I've known. And in the last year and a half, we moved down to just south of Miami, an area called the Redland, which is the heart of the nurseries and the fruit orchards. This just beautiful landscape that is close to Miami, but as far away as you can get conceptually. And you have these amazing materials. This is limestone rock that's excavated. This is a project that we're doing now close to where I live, actually, that's just extracted from the ground, lets you do amazing things like build these waterfalls that you basically quarry the ground, and the stone itself filters and is a substrate for life and ecology. You can see here how things just volunteer and attach the multiple perforations, the water that it holds, the vegetation is just remarkably upheld by this geological form. And this image here is quite striking to me. This was in the process of installing some oaks recently. You see both the, the intentional, very planned, very orchestrated process by which you plant a big tree. And then in the foreground here, this is a lime rock that just shows this, this ficus just emerging and irrepressible. I have the fortune of living in a place that I can look outside, a studio that I just quote unquote finished right before the pandemic. And, you know, this is a view of this little neighbor's house that has coral rock that was excavated from the canals that have allowed South Florida to thrive. And that is, again, a substrate that allows for life to take root and irreversibly. It gives us great inspiration. It allows us to create things like this, which is a project that we're doing here in Miami, where we take these things outside of the ground, we plant them, we irrigate them, and they just take off. But in many ways, where I live is informed by those who live here. Among them, this is one of our dogs, a stray that we allowed in, just opened the gate and he joined us. This is Whiskey. And the uncut grass, the contrast here, is actually an experiment that led to some investigations and ideas over the last year or so, where I left unmowed the areas that I'm planning to build or excavate or turn into one of the ponds or a building, etc. And what it has allowed me to do is to see the landscape in the restraint of not treating it and not mowing it, allowing for these areas to just do their own thing. These amazing juxtapositions take place where you see control and lack of control, and over time, some are newer, like these patches, and some are older, where Whiskey, one of my dogs, was, and it just takes its own sort of momentum. And so this is the environment that inspires me every day. It's a really wonderful place, and it's just a matter of looking at it from multiple scales. I like to do that in our practice, from the micro to the macro, from the regional to the local to the site, and really understand how these various gradients and fuzzy edges give us a chance to better understand where we live and where we work. A lot of what we do is actually also involves doing temporary installations. I view these as basically 3D sketches, and this is one that I always go back to, the Dock Loom. This is done in this gigantic dry dock in California, where basically from the top here to the bottom, it's about 45 feet or so in height, to give you a sense of scale. And this was one of the most productive environments during World War II in shipbuilding. We took this over, we took 13,000 linear feet of yarn, strung it about 16 feet off the ground, and created this effect, which is almost like this hovering horizon of blue, which mimics what the water is doing behind this, this wall, this dam. The ships, this gets flooded, ships used to be brought in, and then the door closes and it gets drained, and this allows for access to the hull. It just sits there as this, you know, majestic theater that's empty most of the time, because that shipyard closed in 1995. And it's just a great setting to experiment like this. What this installation taught me and continues to teach me is just how minimal and subtle and you know, small transformations that benefit from a collective total, when done in a place that gives it that contrast, that juxtaposition of lightness and ephemerality next to this massive, you know, unmoving void, just heightens the lightness and heightens the weight of both of these things. And it's just, as a designer, you know, as someone who you know, does these installations as an art form, these situations and these juxtapositions really sensitize you to the potential of a site. Another project that took place also before moving to Miami in 2005, we did this project in California that in the same shipyard that had a, basically it was a mapping of the ground. And this gives you, again, a sense of the scale. This is a person here that's kind of in a very active shipyard. And so what we did is we took plates of steel, and we located these in formerly productive sites, a shipyard, a staging ground, and a Navy tool shed. Placed these things on the ground. These are about 4 foot by 4 foot, that's the dimension there. Let them weather over time, and then after a couple of months, stop that process of transformation. And I painted them based on the patterns that were created by the water movement, and then sealed them. And what it does is it creates this documentation of deposition, oxidation, erosion, all captured in the surface of the metal, which is a part of the landscape until the moment that it is removed. So in a way, I call it a land print. It's a one-to-one print of the ground, but ultimately it's documenting the process of transformation and movement of water over time. And oftentimes we see these patterns in terms of how it's reflected in vegetation, plant material, organisms that thrive at these edges. And this process of capturing that transformation via these prints are basically stopping time to look at it. A project that we did as part of a competition where we were lucky to get an honorable mention was actually in San Francisco. And this was, I picked this project because not only does it speak to the idea that time is central to a lot of the work that we do, and it's if you can harness it properly, it just reaps rewards in immeasurable ways. But this was actually part of the garden. The San Francisco Botanical Garden wanted to communicate the historical significance of Gondwana land in relation to the communities in the Southern Hemisphere. And this is actually a picture I took of the Smithsonian showing basically just the incredible geological scales of which, as human beings, we are in the top thin, rind, very, very top, almost imperceptible. And so Gondwana land was actually part of this continental mass that was separated. Before that, it was Pangaea. It was separated into Laurasia and Gondwana. And basically, there are relationships which actually New Zealand shares with Chile and South America and parts of the Southern Hemisphere. In terms of the plant material that grows in these are distant cousins. And so the idea of scale and time in this particular project was really important to me to try and explore. We began, as we usually do, by sketching, by situating and trying to get an understanding of scale. This is close to the De Young Museum. You might recognize the structure here. And so we started playing with the idea of movement and how continental masses could move over time. Of course, the danger in a project like this is to create a one-liner where you see it almost like a science fair project and you kind of get the one line and you move on. So here we wanted to do something that would actually change over time. And we selected a tree that you probably know if you're in New Zealand, the Totara tree, the Podocarpus totara, which basically gets to be a massive tree, as you probably understand if you live there. And this is part of the plant collection in the San Francisco Botanical Garden. So what we did is we created the shapes of these continents by outlining their profiles from the ground. So you would get an understanding of these continents if you were inside the piece. We designed a foundation that would be intentionally shifting. The tree would be planted as a sapling at the beginning, and the two sides of the foundation would allow for the roots to move through. And that would cause the actual sculpture to shift. And over time, depending on when you visited it, you would have a sense of how something starts to move and become something else over the course of time and as a function of the growth of the tree. And so this is kind of trying to capture the idea of geological time, but in a way that you work with the design to accept the fact that these things will shift and you welcome that change. Moving on to a project that's a little bit more local. This is a project here in Miami. The university asked me to lead the design of a courtyard that used to look like what you see on the left here. You can see it's somewhat dire, the red mulch and just these lonely and solitary light posts with no life around them, even though 13,000 students use that every semester. We transformed it into this space, and I'll go through and give you a little bit of context there. It has since become one of the more popular spots on campus, which is very close to a lot of the registrars and libraries and things, and it just is a natural gateway for people to move through. The design took this courtyard and created some very large seating that uses the same profile. It just flips it. So in one, it faces in and the other one, it faces out. loose seating, porous paving, and these hanging mesh structures that hold bromeliads or tillandsia that are called air plants that don't need any soil to thrive. These are the benches. We did a prototype out of pipe and plywood, established a profile that will let you stand and lean back, sit on the edge, etc. All with a desire to focus the attention upward into these light structures that would sway because they're untethered, and a perimeter that has a trellis that allows for these blooming sky blue vines to blossom. And the university has blue and gold, and we thought, what a better way to brand than to use this kind of blue in a very striking way with a recycled glass floor. And these are the offices that look into that space, and quite a welcome transformation from what we know of how students post on social media about it. And the views up, the seating is connected to these structures because it lets you look through the skylight above you and look down and see the various activity. We put in a ton of outlets and Wi-Fi boosters, and it's become quite a popular spot. Taking that idea a little further, this is a public art project that I did with a colleague in the School of Architecture, in the College of Communication, Architecture and the Arts, an artist friend, Jacek Koleshinsky. And Jacek and I were commissioned by the Community Foundation of Broward and the YMCA. These are a nonprofit organization and an organization for kids that live on one side of this very, I call it the penitentiary aesthetic of a bridge. They live on one side of this bridge, they go to school on the other. And we wanted to create something that would transform that experience. So we invited them to campus. We hosted multiple exercises. We took them to the museum and had African-American artists speak to the work that was on exhibit. We printed these gigantic aerial photographs. We had the kids identify favorite parts of their community, areas that needed work and areas that had a wish list. And it was really just telling and just so illuminating to take part in that, because you really understood some of the needs and the wish list. You know, they wanted pools, they wanted all kinds of things that were improvements, and this was one of the few times, I think, in our understanding that they were asked what they wanted directly. So we developed this exercise where we interviewed and spoke with many of them, and we listed all the things that they do on a weekly basis, all the destinations that they visited, and then we had them go out to the site. We created stakes with the names of each, and we created a series of living maps that took the trajectory from their home to their school, to the YMCA, to their aunt's house, and just created a series of these maps that informed the final configuration of the installation that we did. We could not touch the bridge because it belongs to the Florida Turnpike, the Department of Transportation. They're typically very challenging to do anything to their structures. So instead, we created the 3 of these shade structures on the left, 3 on the right. And every day, then the kids cross from one side to the other. These giant umbrellas are aligned with their trajectory, and it changes their path. Not only that, but they have these chain link fences that we put over 250,000 zip ties. We had them participate in the installation, and every year the graduating class gets several thousand zip ties, and they change it according to their particular class desire. So it's an installation that creates an infrastructure that can be changed and added over time. Less so on the structures, but more directly on the fences that are usually perceived as negative barriers. It also casts a very subtle shadow, and it's a prideful moment for the community and everybody involved. Lots of people participated in that. I'll move quickly through this project, which Brennan knows very well. This is in Aruba, the island of Aruba, just off the coast of South America, off the coast of Venezuela. Aruba is a former Dutch colony, and this park is located in Oranjestad, which is the capital city. The site is adjacent to some significant improvements that the Aruba was doing to their public transit. They placed a trolley stop very close to the park. They have an academy that is an art and design academy across from the park. So we felt that this was an outside classroom. We looked at the existing vegetation, colors, textures. The national tree is known as the DVDV tree. It's almost like a wind vane because it registers the movement of the wind, the trade winds from the northeast. We catalog plant material, colors, we catalog textures and tile, etc. And we use these to inform our design, which acknowledged the direction of the wind and created a design that was inspired by Gerrit Rietveld, who is the namesake of the school, the Rietveld Academy, and basically took that structure apart. This was done before modernism. Rietveld was part of the still movement. And this was a revolutionary chair that came into being in 1918, believe it or not. And it suggested that space continued, this grid continued, in the same way, in my mind, as the wind registers and continues and shapes the tree in its path. So the design is oriented so that the trade wind grain or the direction follows the geometry of structures above you that give you shade, furnishings, plant material, etc. It's very hot there, so these provide shade. They provide minimal resistance to the winds, and they take the colors and the textures both for the ground, tile, and for the overhead structure. And it creates a destination that I understand now. I have to get pictures of it, but I understand that they do tango lessons in the park, which is a designer's dream. I needed that on my bucket list, tango lessons in the park, and I think we accomplished that. At night, they are illuminated almost like a lantern, so it's active during day and night. And it has really transformed what used to be a surface parking lot. One last slide on this is how it relates to the urban improvements. We situated this trellis in line with the last trolley stop. So by doing that, we connect the improvements, the capital improvements of transportation to this new capital improvement of a public space. And it makes these two things complement each other very well. That's a school behind here and some of the kids in their class. I'd like to end with a project that is near and dear to my heart. It's a research project that we've worked on for many years. And it kind of appeals to this draw that we have to the natural environment, especially in my mind, this allure of the tropics and the subtropics, where as a chair of the program at Florida International University and faculty, we specialize in. And this romanticism, this wildness that is also has an incredible magnetism is something that was difficult to convey except through paintings and illustrations back centuries ago. So plants and animals and things in this quote unquote new world couldn't be transported. They didn't make their way very well back, but they could be illustrated. They could be shown in paintings and illustrations and drawings. And in my mind, they capture the imagination in ways that prove the power of art as this kind of seminal force to change trajectories, investments, etc. Nobody saw this more than one of my idols here, Alexander von Humboldt, whom you might know. This is a guy who was before Darwin. He was out in the Andes and the Himalayas. If you want to read some amazing, amazing narratives, take a look at any of his writings. He took the ecotones of the Himalayas and the Andes, studied how they changed according to their location from the sea level. He documented when water boiled, all along here. But he did that in an extremely powerfully artful way, where it wasn't just raw science, but it was art as well. So that is one of my hopes and dreams for the Ecological Atlas, is to take the idea that we have this immense need, given the encroachment on urban areas into the natural environment. These are all the roads of the world. This is this subtropical band where I've focused for many years, which has currently 3 billion people living, and that's projected to be 6 billion by 2100, 6 out of 10 billion in the world. So this is a zone that requires our best thinking. And so the Ecological Atlas begins here, and a lot of our work has to do with understanding what is normally a very off-putting and confusing, knowledge about the natural world. Most people will look at a forest and have difficulty understanding. I'll resist the pun. It's very difficult to know what's going on. And so what if we look at this as an opportunity to catalog the data, we could take any one of these species, organize it like we have here, for example. This is a typical South Florida palette, create a visual calendar that shows in one glance when things are in bloom, when they are deciduous, etc. And then you can kind of go backward and take any one of those species and drill down digitally, because again, if it's looked at as data, we can then understand it in terms of all this metadata. How salt tolerant is it? How olfactory is it? Where does it come from? And we can craft these stories for every single one of these species to get a full understanding of that ecosystem. And so that's something that we can do, and we can establish patterns. We go outside, we see something that's blooming from April to August, it's red, it looks kind of like this. We know then, working backward, where it fits into this bigger picture. Here, the calendar is vertical, and the species are organized alphabetically. However, they can be organized by bloom time, as you see here. So here, this early bloomers happen towards the bottom left, late bloomers happen towards the top right. You could take that same data and organize it by color so that you can then design a garden that blooms purple and coincides with a particular time of year that's special to you. You can then drill down and say we want it to be minimum maintenance or require minimal water, etc. And all it is taking data that we have painstakingly assembled and mined from multiple databases, and then transform that into these visual graphics. So these become this almost like a DNA strand of the natural world that surrounds you, that shows fruit seasons in the previous image. It shows butterfly patterns. It shows how birds migrate through your zone. And here you can see 300 and, well, this one is half of those, but we catalog 350 birds. We can show when they're mating. We can show when they're moving through the region. We can display it as art, because ultimately I firmly believe that to change behavior, facts and figures really won't do it. It's really appealing to the emotion, to this visceral connection that often comes through art, often comes through space, through place, through culture, through people. And if we're able to capture that well, then we can make all kinds of changes, positive changes in the environment as a result. The data that you saw there here is organized according to communities from uplands down to the water. So we have taken this information and connected geographic location with temporal information. We've taken all the plants in South Florida, native plants that we've cataloged, which are, out of all the ones we've cataloged, there's 84. We reduced it to the ones that are salt tolerant. Again, thinking of storm surge, thinking of sea level rise. And we can visualize the impact of what that means. I think abstractly people know there's going to be a change environmentally, but the moment that you show it in these visual, easy to understand terms, again, it just paints a picture that's a lot clearer. And so here, the other thing that we have been doing is connecting the species to their particular habitat by mapping each of these flowers to all of the butterfly larvae for which they serve as hosts. We can understand the impact of this particular plant. Similarly, as nectar plants, as adult butterflies, this other plant provides nourishment for these species. And then we can create one comprehensive image that shows all of these connections, and then filter out for salt tolerance and really see the impact of what sea level rise can and cannot do in our environment. And so that same data here is showing fruit for South Florida. We have adapted it for fish as well, showing spawning seasons. And this is helpful again for painting a picture of when it makes sense to fish and not fish, etc. And I will wrap up with this little video that we put together for it. Oop. Oh, sorry, I cut it short. Let's see. Well, it has a grand finale, but I know that I'm running a little bit over on time. So let's see. I don't know where we left off, but perhaps I can pause there because I know that I'm running a little long, and I'm more than happy then to take questions. But basically, the presentation today, I wanted to show how our approach, and in my mind, these things are all very much connected. Through the idea of installations that are temporary, but to try to tap into some unseen reality or some insight about a place. I think there's a lot of really powerful design concepts that particular endeavor, these short installations, can do, and at the same time that these things don't exist in a vacuum. And with a tool like Ecological Atlas and some of the other projects that I shared, it's kind of an ongoing investigation. It doesn't, there's no set formula, but it's always about asking questions in many different ways. And ultimately that leads to, design that's informed by people, place, and ecology. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto. Well, I guess I'll launch some of the questions and answers. But I just wanted to point out that I know this is just scratching the surface of your research and your work, and there's so much more behind it. And I think we get the core values of context, time, and scale, and you have a delicate balance between all those. And you have an explicit use of vegetation, performance, and people, which is incredibly inspirational. So I guess I'm sure other people have questions, but I'll start off by asking, how do you actually bring this to the table maybe when you have a client? So without losing any of that sort of creative impetus, How do you bring it to the practical, pragmatic realities of dealing with clients' expectations and delivery of, you know, these designs? And it's a very practical question. So we can start there.
No, it's good. It's very, very important. I think, I mean, if we didn't have that practical consideration in mind, you know, I don't think we'd be able to sort of sustain and continue doing the work that we do. And I think that it's important to understand that a lot of these investigations many of the installations, for example, are self-driven. That body of work has led to grants and has led to different, I guess, projects that change that paradigm and in the way that we seek projects, you know. So establishing a body of work that is in line with what we want to do has meant that a lot of the projects that come to us is because people understand that, and they're not looking for us to do other kinds of projects that perhaps don't have as much of an interest in, you know, in these ideas, and, you know, and so I think that there's a lot that automatically happens when you do the work and when you put it out there, when you exhibit it and publish it and share it with folks. And that leads to, I think, a smaller Venn diagram where you really have a sweet spot where the projects that you do and the people who seek you have know basically what the expectations are. So I think that helps quite a bit. And a lot of the work that we have been doing for many years now are referred from one client to the other. So from that sense, it's kind of like a self-energizing.
Cool, thank you. Please, if anybody else has questions, please just go ahead and unmute yourself, I believe, and go for it.
Well, whilst people still warm up with their question, Roberto, thank you for that. I think was absolutely mesmerizing and inspiring. I think my question is related more to the discipline and to the profession at large. What do you think that are the current challenges that the profession will be facing, especially now in the light of the COVID-19 situation? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, some things have changed dramatically, and some things have and should stay, I think, you know, consistent with sensitive and smart and intelligent design. I think that the idea that we can just design in a vacuum, that we can go to school and learn best practices in whatever that means and wherever you are, and just apply them globally without a certain humility about how to approach the work. I think that that's something that hopefully people are starting to understand and learn. It's really essential that you have a ground level understanding, a conversation, a dialogue, multiple, to really rethink and question the assumptions that you go in with. And I think that, again, goes to this idea of being humble as a designer and listening, and as well as being, you know, ambitious and courageous with your ideas, so that you're not simply reinforcing the status quo. So I think that that is something that has to remain, and the best ideas and the best projects manage to do that well. The you know, the ones that fail are the ones that kind of overlook some obvious things. How we have to change, clearly, I think, even though the seismic shift specifically in education and having to work remotely, how this has impacted our day-to-day operation, I think we're more equipped than we have ever been to work remotely, to collaborate remotely, to share work remotely. And so in our experience at Florida International, I was chatting with Brennan about this. I mean, and I'm sure it's true for you as well at Victoria. You know, we had no choice. We had to adapt. We had 24 hours to go remotely, and that was shocking to have to do. But by and large, I think I don't know, the nature, I think, is specifically for landscape architects, landscape architecture students, faculty. I think everybody was a really good sport about it, and we're willing to experiment and do all that. I think from my practice, I have a small team, but we collaborate. I have one of my folks works remotely, works in Venezuela, actually, something which I'm very happy and proud, knowing the challenges of Venezuela right now, and having lived in Venezuela as a teen myself. So we work remotely, we collaborate, we have all these tools that allow us to do that. So we have to just adapt and always be looking at what's next, not what suits us at the moment, but how can we be better at it? For the longest time, I think we resisted studio education and had an online digital component.
That's right.
And yet here we are. So it's really about looking, embracing that, and not just accepting it, but really figuring out how can we do it even better than we were before. I think, just my optimistic nature thinks and knows that we can do that.
Great answer.
Does anybody have any other questions?
There's a question on a chat group. Would you like to read it, Brandon?
Yes. Roberto, how did you start the cataloging, and who did you work with to produce such a beautiful and very overwhelming information of natural elements?
Well, how did that project, the Ecological Atlas, start? Actually, it was trying to figure out a way to convey changes in the environment and communicate that well. I mean, for the longest time, I've always been really, what fascinates me and draws me to, and continues to draw me into landscape architecture, is how humbling it is. And a lot of that has to do with just the role that time plays. No matter our best intentions, we have ideas of what things should be, but like that stone at the beginning, the oolite rock, I mean, those things just take off. And, the best thing you can do is anticipate and allow for these things to happen and approximate the direction that you want them to go in, but it's humbling. So one of those things is, how do you show? We go on and on about, the seasons and the changes in the environment, and it's beautiful, trust me, it's going to be amazing to have all these species, and they're going to bring all these pollinators. But we have to acknowledge that for a lot of people, it's difficult to accept or understand or to simply visualize these things. So it was a personal challenge for me to try and come up with the most simple, intuitive way to communicate this. And once you start doing it, I started with just bloom times of native flowers. Then it becomes obvious that, well, you can do that for any living thing. And then not only can you do that, but you can start to maximize and leverage technology so that you start to speak about relationships, which is what ecology is, a set of ongoing relationships. And so that is ultimately how the project has continued to evolve. Where I am with it is now that we have all this data, is having a way to do that, automating that digitally. We have some code that allows us to go visual just from a spreadsheet, but it's really about developing software that will automate that even more. And that takes time and it takes funding. So that's kind of where the project is. And we began just by collecting information from databases and assembling it. But we began just with bloom times, and then that evolved into different organisms and continues to evolve into many, many different things.
Quite a tedious process. All right, well, thank you. That was a great question. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up the session. And we want to thank you so very much, Roberto, for presenting, and thank you for your time. And all right, well, hopefully we'll see you.
How do you say goodbye in Maori?
Kia ora.
Kia ora. So hello and goodbye is the same? Kia ora is hello, or?
Kia ora. Yeah, it's like aloha, I guess you could say. Similar.
Okay, very good. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And if you want to watch the rest of the video, sorry that I preempted it. I must have clicked inadvertently. Just go to my website, which is myname.com. And I'm happy to continue the conversation. So thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you. See you soon, Roberto.
Okay, take care.